This is Mulligan Stew, the podcast, music, film, food, and wine. For the next 2 weeks, film. One of my pleasures this summer was to be part of a large group of film critics with the Los Angeles-based Broadcast Film Critics Association, BFCA, reviewing and screening documentaries. I expected there might be maybe, 78, 100. No. Links for almost 400 documentaries showed up in my email box. Two of them that made a huge impression on me were next week's interview for Sama. Check that one out. But the first one is Where's My Roy Cohn? Cohn. People of a certain age will know exactly who Roy Cohn was. He was a lawyer dressed up as an attack dog. Some of Cohn's best-known exploits included spearheading J. Edgar Hoover and Joseph McCarthy's crusade against homosexuals, helping pave Ronald Reagan's path to the Oval Office, torpedoing Geraldine Ferraro's historic bid for the vice presidency, keeping many American mafiosos out of jail, and looting the bank accounts of his legal clients. And he was a lawyer. His life has been well written up. Actually, in Tony Kirshner's Angels in America, Roy Cohn represents everything that was wrong with the United States of America in the 1980s. Literally, Roy Cohn wrote the playbook on right-wing politics in America. Smear your opponent, attack, never admit you did anything wrong, double down, accuse your accusers of what you're guilty of, be a bully, be a coward, be a victim. One of the architects of right-wing government that we're seeing unfolding before us in the White House was Roy Cohn. And the title, Where is My Roy Cohn, came from President Donald Trump when Jeff Sessions would not recuse himself heading into the Mueller investigation. And he said to the room, to the lawyers gathered around him, where is my Roy Cohn? He needed an attack dog, a nasty, dark human being. And he's now surrounded himself with a committee of those type people. But there was one and only Roy Cohn, and we're going to tell you that story right now. The director of Where's My Roy Cohn is Matt Tyrnauer, and he will be standing at the podium holding an award for the next number of months to come. Here's a conversation with Matt Tyrnauer. I'm Terry David Mulligan, and this is Mulligan Stew, the podcast, music, film, food, and wine. We're going to talk film. Matt Tyrnauer, the director of an amazing documentary called Where's My Roy Cohn, is on the phone with me. With a podcast, you never know how young or old your audience is going to be, whoever's coming in to listen. And so for a younger generation, they may have no idea about this story, or it will come as a surprise to them. For those of us who lived through it and were around the edges of it, it's something that scarred you for life. You'll never forget about it. Tell us about the title, because every documentary needs a title, and you had a perfect one.
Well, this is, I think, the first time a film title has been handed down by a sitting president. Donald Trump in 2017 was confronted with the recusal of his attorney general at that time, Jeff Sessions, and it was the incipient Mueller investigation, and Trump was deeply concerned about the prospects of investigation and indictment and eventual impeachment, and he wanted Sessions to unrecuse himself to protect Trump. A mafia boss would be protected by a mob lawyer. So he blurted out, according to the New York Times, where's my Roy Cohn, which gave me the title for the film.
And that, in a nutshell, and it's remember when when we heard the title of a film, Snakes on a Plane, and I thought, that's fantastic. You know exactly what the movie's about. It's snakes on a plane. Yeah. And the same thing applies to the title of this documentary, Matt, simply because it's just the name alone conjures up a time and a place. The 50s, for example, when he was he was surfing the wave. He was on top of his game. But as you well know, I think it was Harvey Levin at People's Court who said, we hate lawyers. We all hate lawyers. until we need one. And then we want the biggest junkyard dog that ever came along. And that's what he was.
Yeah.
That was his role, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he really defined a lot of things for the second half of the 20th century. And what compelled me to make the film was the surprising fact that he redefined a lot of things for the first 2 decades of the 21st century. He's first identified with the McCarthy period, where he's Joseph McCarthy's chief counsel and is really embedded in the era of McCarthyism and witch hunting, and has this notorious reputation from a very young age. Later on, after the disgrace of McCarthy, and I should point out Cohen was disgraced along with McCarthy.
Right.
He reinvents himself as a power broker and attorney, including mob attorney, for the dons of the 5 families of the mafia in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And his reputation is a killer lawyer, and he branded himself as that brilliantly, and he was that. He wasn't much of a kind of by-the-books legal scholar. He was an attack dog, and the most prominent people of that time hired him to defend their interests, and frequently their interests were crooked, but he managed to keep them insulated from the force of the legal system.
This is Mulligan Stew, the podcast. Matt Tyrnauer, the director of an amazing documentary called Where's My Roy Cohn, is on the phone with me, and we'll be hearing a lot more about this film and Matt's work as we head towards awards season, absolutely positively. Now, the footage you were able to get your hands on, even the footage that came along that you maybe weren't expecting. Sometimes it's happen chance when you start to look for elements to go into a documentary. Where were the surprises for you in what you saw and what you heard?
Well, he lived a televised life in many ways. The Army McCarthy hearings, which were 54, and he was central to those, were televised, and they were really the first major nationally televised moment. So he's on camera from his early 20s, and he never really stops being on camera or seeking the attention of news cameras. And his persona on camera is very distinct. It's this very slick-talking attack dog, and he has a certain amount of dark charm. Later in life, when he's being indicted and assailed for corporate malfeasance and even at one point accused of murder regarding a yacht he owned that was scuttled at sea, and someone went down with the ship, and it was suspected that it was Roy Cohn behind this wrongful death. He has a kind of catch me if you can charm to him in the way that some villains in movies or even operas have a certain dark charm. And this comes through in all of this footage. There were 2 60 Minutes pieces done on him, one with Morley Safer and the other with Mike Wallace. And the footage on those is just extraordinary. I mean, we got all that footage, and you're right in the townhouse in which he lived and worked with him, and you're in his bedroom, and there's a mirror on the ceiling.
Yeah.
And to make matters even stranger, there's a collection of stuffed frog plushies in this bedroom, and we're in the bedroom with him while he's in his workout clothes doing sit-ups and giving dictation to his handsome, well-built male secretary. So all of this larger-than-life, eccentric, decadent behavior was evident in the archival footage that we found. He's with mafia bosses. He's with Fat Tony Salerno in the back of a limousine, and you're really up with him. And we found remarkable footage from every period of his life. In fact, we found photographs that were his own photographs that had never been seen before. So part of the visual landscape of this film is a lot of amazing imagery that I worked very hard to get and weave into the narrative. It's something that I've spent a lot of time on.
There are people out there who are listening who are younger than you and I, and they're saying, well, how does this affect, why? Why are we talking about somebody in the 50s and the 60s who had a 28-year career? How does it now reflect on what I'm dealing with now? And that's really is the incredible through line, because one of his mentorships was with a young Donald Trump. How did it begin, and how tight was it?
Very tight. Began in the 70s when Trump was nobody. He was a outer borough scion of a real estate fortune. No one in Manhattan cared about him or knew who he was, but he had a burning desire to conquer Manhattan. And Roy Cohn had already done that. He was the scoundrel in chief of New York City. People referred to him as a lovable monster. He was the mob lawyer and the power broker and fixer. He was a very feared attorney. And Trump, as a young man, along with his father, had gotten into trouble with the Justice Department for violating the Fair Housing Act, and they were not renting apartments to people of color. It's a terrible scandal, and they should have been, they were rightfully pursued by the Justice Department and sued. Trump meets Cohen at a nightclub called Le Club, and there turned out to be a match made in heaven in many ways. He hires Cohen to defend himself and his father, and Cohen gives them what turned out to be great advice. It's very unethical advice, really, or at least pushes the ethics of lawyering. He tells them to countersue the Justice Department for $100 million. That counterclaim was soon dismissed, but it had the effect of throwing their opponents off balance, and eventually it shook down into a settlement with no admission of guilt. And Trump cast that as a victory, which was something Roy Cohn had learned in the McCarthy period, when McCarthy had when McCarthy had defeats, he would cast them as victories, and Cohen became very expert at doing that. It's a great legal tactic, in fact, when you lose, because our system allows you appeals frequently, so you can claim victory and then appeal, etc. So Trump's always done this, learned it from Roy Cohn, and they were basically the nefarious Bobbsey twins after that. Cohn was always at his side, helping him gain favor with the establishment and giving him access to not only the political power grid of the United States at that time, but also secret access to the mafia, because Cohen had these relationships. And when you're in the building trade, which Trump was at that time, before he became a reality TV star, you can use those connections, especially in that period. The building trades and the unions were very much controlled by the mafia in that period. So Roy Cohn was not only a mentor of Trump's, but he was a very useful person to have at your side if you were Donald Trump.
This is Mulligan Stew, the podcast. Matt Tyrnauer, the director of an amazing documentary called Where's My Roy Cohn? When we turn on the television set today, if we turn on the television set today and we watch headline news, and we watch CNN or MSNBC or whatever, what are we seeing from Trump that can actually positively be traced back to Roy Cohn?
That's just a great question. And the answer is everything.
Yeah.
People who I interviewed who knew both men, more than one of these people who knew them both in their prime or at the origin of their relationship, say that Donald Trump is Roy Cohn. He absorbed him entirely. Cohn was a brilliant man, actually, and that's why in many ways he's a good character, because he's a brilliant person who used his intelligence for evil. And there's something really compelling about that as a character for a film. It's almost unbelievable, in fact, to the extent that he did it. I'll take a half a step back here and point out that if Trump had not won the Electoral College and been elected president because of that, Cohen would be a bold footnote to American history, remembered as a character in Tony Kushner's Angels in America, right, where he serves as a kind of metaphor for many things that were wrong in the culture in that period of the 80s. In light of Trump's election to the most powerful position in the world, he becomes a modern Machiavelli. So this is his importance now. This is his significance. He creates a president from beyond the grave because the playbook of Trump is the playbook of Cohen, and
right,
that is smear your opponents, attack, never admit you're wrong.
Deny.
Double down.
Yep.
Double down. And you see it every day in and day out. And as Trump gets more and more exposed and gets into more and more political trouble, and the media goes after him, every reaction he has is a reaction he learned from Roy Cohn. So even when he blurts witch hunt in his tweets, he's echoing the tactics that Cohen deployed in the McCarthy period, which is accusing your accusers of what you're guilty of. Basically.
Sure.
That's another major one.
Matt Tyrnauer is the director of Where's My Roy Cohn? It's about Roy Cohn, a ruthless lawyer from the 50s and 60s. And what you see today in the news is a direct result of Donald Trump, a young Donald Trump, being mentored by Roy Cohn. Where did Roger Stone come in to all of this?
Stone was a figure who was also a mentee of Roy Cohn's starting in the 70s. Cohn really had Stone at his side, and that kind of dirty trick. You have to remember that when Trump flirted with the presidency, and everyone, of course, thought this was a joke for decades, he would always float his name as
Sure.
a potential presidential contender. And it was a joke, frankly, because he was a joke. Stone was the one who was really doing that. He was a political consultant, and Trump was using him for that purpose. And Cohen died of complications from HIV/AIDS in 1986, and he had already passed everything he knows to Roger Stone and to Trump, and they were kind of carrying that on for other purposes at the time. Roger Stone is interviewed in the film, and he speaks surprisingly articulately about Cohn and Trump.
Trump washed his hands of Roy Cohn in those last 5-6 weeks when he was dying of AIDS, which shouldn't come as a surprise. It's just, it's amazing what happened to the man and how hard he fell.
Yes, well, Cohn was very powerful, very influential, got away with, some people speculate, literally murder, but certainly metaphorically, for years. And he was all those things until he wasn't. And a few things conspired to bring him down. He was, for decades, being pursued by the Justice Department and attorneys general for all of the crimes he committed, but they could never get him. He wiggled out. In much the way we see Trump in the Mueller phase of his being assailed for wrongdoing, he wiggles out of these really tight scrapes. And again, Cohen gave him all of the tactics to achieve that. But Cohen finally, when he was in his late 50s, the Bar Association found a way to corner him, and he was disbarred in the last weeks of his life. And at that time, he was very sick with complications brought on by the HIV/AIDS illness he had. And many people deserted him as his life began to cascade, and Trump was certainly among those people. Ironically, you could say a lot of really bad things about Cohen, and they'd all be deserved. The thing that some people do credit him with was a sense of loyalty. Now, I like to point out that the mafia has loyalty, too. It's called Omerta, and it's one of the pillars of organized crime. Cohen had that kind of omerta outlook that mobsters have. And he did have, or had cultivated, lasting friendships that were transactional, really, but they were friendships nonetheless. Trump didn't even seem to have the loyalty, though, and when Cohen was a dying man, he took the legal business away and did distance himself, which, doesn't speak well. But the whole relationship really is diabolical, because we need to understand where this American monster comes from. And Trump is a symptom of a systemic structural corruption in American society and really global politics right now. But Cohen really was the propagator of a lot of this, and he was present at the creation of a lot of this corruption. So it's no accident that the person who emerges in this moment, this kind of dark political moment, is in fact directly connected to Roy Cohn.
Matt Tyrnauer is the director of an amazing documentary called Where's My Roy Cohn? A ruthless lawyer from the 50s and 60s. And what you see today is a direct result of a young Donald Trump being mentored by Roy Cohn. And the conflict was the fact that he was purging Hollywood with Senator Joe McCarthy. They were a 1-2 punch. And then they turned to the dark art of exposing homosexuality and homosexuals in all businesses, especially political. And yet here he was, a closet homosexual, and was really never outed, if I'm reading correctly.
Yes, you raised a great point. His hypocrisy is world class. Kushner in Angels in America certainly gets at this, but if you unpack it and look at the record, he's a gay man who's in collusion with McCarthy, wrecking the lives of other gay men and women in the government and other aspects of society in the 1950s. And he never apologizes, repents, atones, however you want to put it, for that. He never comes out. And I want to point out that, as a lawyer in the 50s, or he was even a lawyer in the 40s as a very young man, there's no out as a lawyer. You're not openly gay in that period in any profession, really. No. That's not what's wrong with Roy Cohn. What's wrong with Roy Cohn is the hypocrisy of being a gay man who destroyed the lives of other gay people, never confronting that sin. And in later days, when he was living a kind of life, open secret life, you could say, as someone who was known to be gay but wouldn't admit it, he has other really, really horrific and difficult public moments. As a person who is one of the earlier victims of AIDS, he accepts special preferential treatment from the Reagan administration and gets into an experimental program at the National Institutes of Health to try to forestall the disease, and no one really could get into this program. The Reagan's record on the HIV crisis is abysmal. Yeah. Reagan never mentioned it until the last months of his presidency, and yet here they are giving preferential treatment to someone who's already a hypocrite about his sexuality and does nothing himself to raise awareness. It's a very, very tragic and horrifying passage, which serves as a kind of capstone to his venal hypocrisy.
This is Mulligan Stew, the podcast. Matt Tyrnauer, the director of an amazing documentary called Where's My Roy Cohn? 2 questions, I'll let you go, Matt. And one is Rudy Giuliani playing the role of Cohn? I know he's a completely different person from Roy Cohn, but is that his role today?
I think Trump has really outsourced the Cohn role to several people, including himself partially. I think all of these lawyers like Giuliani and Attorney General Bill Barr and this character named Stephen Miller, who's a White House aide, clinging to his power position. They all have facets of Cohn. They're very protective of Trump in the way that Cohen was in his time, and they're all using this Roy Cohn playbook, but none of them really knew Cohen, certainly not like Trump did. So Trump learned from the master at the side of the master of this really perverted Machiavellian way of conducting yourself, and I think he is leading as his own Roy Cohn with sort of deputy Roy Cohns in the person of these people. It's a terrible situation, and I really think that Roy Cohn's the root cause of it, which is, again, why the film was made, to point this out. We don't know where this comes from. We can't try to stem it as we move forward.
And finally, the timeline is of interest to me, Matt. When did you start to think about, seriously, you went, okay, I think I'm going to tell this story. Where was Trump in his rise at that point?
It was during the election year of 2016. I was making a movie called Studio 54 about the famous nightclub, and Roy Cohn was in the middle of that.
Right.
He was a denizen of Studio 54, and he was the lawyer for the club, which had a fall from grace due to a skimming and tax evasion scandal, and Cohn defended them. So I was watching all of this footage of Roy Cohn. I knew that he was Trump's mentor, and I kept thinking to myself, well, this is a great character for a film. He's leaping off the screen, and he's got such a picaresque career, and there's so much important to what he did in the narrative of America. But the real reason to make that movie would be if Trump won, and I was, of course, convinced that Hillary Clinton would be the next president, and there would be no reason to make this movie because Roy Cohn would be a footnote to history. When the opposite occurred, really the day after the election or the electoral college victory of Trump, I started to write the treatment for this.
And no one knows how it's going to play out because each day is different from the last.
You're very right. I do think that if you look at the way Cohn behaved, you have to look at what the legal structures of the United States can do to end the presidency.
Do you know if he's seen the film?
I don't. It's the White House. One of the traditions is that the president can request any film from the Motion Picture Academy, and it's sent, and you would know if it were officially requested. But in the age of DVDs and streaming, you never really know whether anyone's seen anything. I don't know whether he has or not.
Matt, have yourself an incredible continued run with this film. It's opening across the country and across the world. I thank you for the work and the dedication that you obviously, it's on the screen. The work that you did is on the screen, and for that we thank you. Have a great run.
Thanks. What a great interview. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt. Matt Tyrnauer is the director of Where's My Roy Cohn, a documentary that's just causing lineups wherever it opens. It's about Roy Cohn, a ruthless lawyer from the 50s and 60s, who in fact mentored Donald Trump. And what you see today in the news, on your television set, in your newspapers, is a direct result of Donald Trump, a young Donald Trump, being mentored by Roy Cohn. And what you see and hear from Donald Trump today comes directly from Roy Cohn. As I explained at the beginning of this podcast, there are two documentaries, one after the other. Next week, the documentary that stole my heart and my head, For Sama, S-A-M-A. At the time that the documentary was made in Aleppo, was just a baby. She's 3 now. But she was born in the middle of the bombing, the horrible war that was waged upon the people of Aleppo. Her mother was a citizen journalist. She had a camera, and she was shooting the Arab Spring until it turned into a war. Wad al-Khatib. Wad married, in the middle of the bombing, Hamza al-Khatib, the only doctor really left working in Aleppo. She shot 500 hours of video after 5 years, escaped the war, and connected with Edward Watts, a documentary filmmaker who understood what he was seeing when those 500 hours of video rolled in front of him. It won the Best Documentary Award at the Cannes Film Festival, South by Southwest. It is currently nominated for Best Director and Best Narration by the Critics' Choice Documentary Awards, which will happen November the 19th. For those of you who are fans of Rotten Tomatoes, very rarely do you ever see any film given 100% critics' marks, and it stays there at 100%. That documentary is For Sama. And if you haven't seen it on a screen where you live, PBS Frontline will air it on November the 19th. Next week, the whole story behind For Sama with Wad El-Khatib, Hamza El-Khatib, and Edward Watts.